All right. Thank you all for coming out to the March installment of Ember NYC. Um, we have a shorter than usual lineup tonight, but a really good one. And for those of you who have been to some of our longer meetups, you're probably feeling very grateful right now. But I wanted to start off by thanking our sponsors, and those are a few folks. The first is Pivotal Labs, whose offices we're sitting in, and whose pizza we're eating and drinks we're drinking. Pivotal has been a gracious host of Ember NYC for almost 2 years now, I think. So we're very grateful to them. Pivotal, for those of you who don't know, is an agile consultancy. And they are both an awesome place to work if you're interested in doing things like pair programming and working with other great developers, and also a great place to have build your application, particularly if you're an early stage startup looking to get a kind of MVP built. It's one of their sweet spots. In addition to Pivotal, we have a few other sponsors who I want to thank. The first is my company, Yap Labs. That does Ember training and consulting. And if you're interested in that, you can talk to me or to Ray Cohen, who's here in the third row. Simple Reach, who hosted our most recent Hacker Hours and has been a regular host of Hacker Hours, it's another sponsor. And I'm really excited to announce a new sponsor, Movable Inc., who is going to be hosting one Hacker Hours a month going forward, starting with the first one next week. Which brings me to upcoming events. So we're here today, it's March 27th. On Monday night, we're going to do the first Hacker Hours at Movable Inc. For those of you who are not familiar with what the Hacker Hours concept, it is a smaller format, more intimate, less organized event. So there's no scheduled talks the way that we have at our monthly meetup, but there is a lot more opportunity to sit down, code, get some help from other folks who might have some more experience than you, talk through problems with each other, and so it's been a really great way to just have a different style of event and really get to know people well in the community. We'll be back here at Pivotal on Wednesday, April 16th. I'm looking for a main talk for that event, so if you are interested in that or you have topics to request, let me know. And then we just scheduled, with thanks to Pivotal, our May dates so everybody can plan ahead. That's going to be Thursday, May 29th. So one other logistics thing, which is that the first East Coast Ember conference is going to be happening in Boston, being put on by our friends at Dockyard on June 17th. Tickets are on sale now. And the CFP is open also if you are interested in submitting a talk. I would encourage you to do both of those things, grab tickets and submit a talk if that's something you're interested in. So I am pretty exhausted right now. We just came off of 2 days in Portland, Oregon for the first EmberConf. It was a terrific event. And Taras and I just flew back this morning. When I flew out, there were at least 7 people on my plane going to EmberConf, which was pretty cool. And we flew back with John Paul as well. So I put together just a few quick slides to hopefully give you a flavor of EmberConf and also to make you aware of some things to be on the lookout for as the videos and slides start to come out from the conference. So let me run that. So my daughter is learning Keynote and she did my transitions, so I don't know what to expect here. So the conference was over 400 people. It was a single track conference in a big ballroom. And that, if you have attended that kind of conference, it makes for great energy and great kind of a camaraderie because it's a shared experience. Everybody kind of sees the same talks and goes through the same schedule. And so that on top of just the overall level of excitement in the Ember community at the moment was just great. So it was awesome to put lots of names to GitHub handles and Twitter handles to faces. The event was super well organized by Leah Silber, um, and the food. Not the food at the conference was the best food I ever had at any conference, and the food in Portland overall was just incredible. I had not been there for about a decade, and I was really blown away. My recommendation is a restaurant called Puk Puk. It's a James Beard Thai restaurant. Was out of control, delicious. And the talks were excellent as well. So these are my top 4. This is subjective. These are my top 4 talks. But as the videos come out, I would encourage you to check these out in particular. Edward Faulkner did a great talk about animations, and he sort of divided it into 2 categories. Talked about animating values. So if you've got a bound value, moving from animating, going from one state to another, and then he also talked about animating route changes. And he had a pretty good approach for working with today, the router that we have today in terms of handling animations, leveraging the will transition event handler. So it was really well done, and his slide deck is an Ember app, so therefore it has all sorts of great examples of animations with Ember code. So if you look him up, I'm pretty sure that he's EF4 on Twitter. So you can probably, I think has already linked it. Eric Berry, who's CoderBerry on Twitter, did a terrific talk about testing. Talked about unit test, integration tests, and also the brand new Ember QUnit project, which has some really terrific ways to reduce boilerplate in your testing code. Since in particular, there's functions where you can do module for controller, for example, specify the controller name, and have a controller instance that's all ready to test right there, which is pretty great. Ryan Florence had a great talk about components. Ryan works over at a company called Instructure and showed a bunch of examples of components that they've built there. He also showed a component that he used to fly a quadcopter over the audience at EmberConf, which was a pretty crazy moment. But he had a lot of really good insights into how to organize components and great examples of nesting components within each other, which is great for doing things like tabs and panes, for example. And then by far, easily the most tear-jerking moment of the conference was a talk that Devaris Brown from Zendesk gave about teaching Ember to disadvantaged kids. It was amazing what these kids were able to put together, and also what they've now gone on to do just within the less than a year later. They were mostly able to read the guides and learn Ember, which, and those of you who were part of the community a year ago would be shocked that this is possible, but the guides have gotten really good. And so that was awesome, and it really sparked a lot of people to try to figure out how do we do that kind of thing in this community. So if that's something that you're interested in collaborating in New York on, let me know, and I'm happy would love to help promote that as part of the meetup. So there's also some news that came out of the conference that I want to share. Robert Jackson was named to the Ember core team. If you follow tickets and commits, this guy has been absolutely tireless. He was previously a member of the Ember release team, and he's just become really indispensable to getting the regular cadence of releases out. And so he's now a full member of the core team, which is great. HTML bars, which we saw a talk from Eric Brin last month, is getting closer. News, I think we knew that the jQuery dependency for Ember was going to become optional once HTML bars landed, but what I also learned is that the handlebars runtime dependency is also going to become optional. So if you precompile your templates, which I recommend, you don't need to ship handlebars at all once we have HTML bars landed. And that's work that Chris Selden and Eric Brin were doing nonstop the week before the conference, and they're getting pretty close on it. Steph from here in NYC, my colleague, gave a talk about Ember CLI, which is starting to become usable. I wanted to give a quick demo for those of you who haven't seen it. So I've previously cloned Stefan Penner /Ember-CLI, and done a npm install -g, and now I'm in my projects directory. Now that I've done that, I can say ember new hi NYC, and it created a project directory for me. It created a basic app structure or app directory structure. It's installing packages for tooling via npm. The other thing that it does the first time that you do this, it asks your permission to report analytics, to report stats back to the Ember CLI project. And so Steph put this in, it's totally opt-in, but if you opt in, and I hope that many people do, we'll be able to get a real sense of how people are using this tool and to be able to improve it as a result. This tool is also going to be the way that what we build the Ember ecosystem of components and shared libraries on top of. And so by being able to understand what people are installing and using, we'll be able to feed that back out into the community so you can get a sense of if a component you're considering using is in use by a lot of people, or it's something maybe that the community has discarded. It's always a challenge in open source to figure out the difference. So it also installed browser packages via Bower. So I can now cd into this directory, what I called it, hi NYC, and I can say, let's actually say Ember help. And so I can see the commands that are available. Init is if you already have a directory that you want to create inside of. Running builds, Ember server is going to fire up a server and automatically recompile code as it changes, so that you can do control R, command R style development, where you can just refresh and see stuff. There's a very basic Ember generate helper that I integrated using Loom. And so you can say Ember generate controller and then specify the controller name, and it'll automatically create that in the right place for you. But for now, just to finish this little demo, we'll say Ember server, and it's going to says it's firing up live reload, and it's firing up a actual server, and then we can open that up, and we have your probably familiar Ember app kit and JS bins kind of starting point. So a little Ember app that you can now build off of. So for those of you who have worked with other frameworks in the past who have this kind of command line tooling, it's great for productivity, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how this evolves. And everybody was pretty jazzed about it at the conference. Alex Mechnier talked about the query params work that's going on. So for those of you who don't know, there's a feature, that's an unreleased feature that's feature flagged in Ember today called query params new. And so you can opt into it if you're using the Canary build. And he actually asked for a show of hands during his talk of like, who's using this in production? And probably 25% of the room or so raised their hands. And he said, you're not, it's not really supposed to use this in production yet. But that's where it's at. It does seem like the API is pretty stable. There's some tricky parts left to work through, specifically around should query params be sticky? For example, if you were to leave a section of your app and come back to it, should it remember the query param in that case? You can kind of make the case both ways, and so we need to figure out what the default should be, and then what you should be able to opt into. But the most interesting thing I think for me that came out of Alex's talk, and I know Alex's slides are, he linked off of his Twitter account, which is HTY. The most interesting part is this idea of model-dependent state, which is the idea that if a controller has some state that it wants to store, transient state, which most controller state is transient, but it wants to store that linked to a particular model. So imagine you have a blog, you got a simple blog site, and each post is using the same route and the same post controller, but you want to do something, record some information a little bit differently for each post as the user is moving through. Maybe they've got something collapsed in the sidebar for one post, and you want that to be sticky for that post, but not as they move to other posts. This idea is we think is a new primitive for Ember that we'll be able to build the rest of the query params work on top of, but also we'll have other utility. So that was pretty cool. One last bit of news. Oh, so one of the other talks, a gentleman whose name is escaping me right now, launched a new site which you can check out. It's called fnd.io, and basically he was really frustrated with the iTunes store, and so he reverse engineered the JSON APIs that the iTunes store uses and rewrote the whole thing in Ember. And it's faster and more compelling than the Apple experience. So that was pretty wild. And it was also pretty interesting because I know that there were at least 8 or 9 people from Apple in the audience. None of them were working on that app, but so that's that. I grabbed a couple of photos. Joe Liss on the far left gave a talk about broccoli. You may follow Stanley Stewart on Twitter. He helps out. He's on the Ember release team. Of course, Steph Devaris-Brown, who I mentioned, and this is Eric Berry, who gave the testing talk. It was it was one of the best. It was the best testing talk I've ever seen on Ember, but just a really great talk overall. Oh, and then there's this guy, Michael Chan. I think pretty sure his Twitter handle is Chantastic. Every session, he took notes that look like this, which are pretty awesome. It's pretty cool. So that's worth checking out. Yes, he tweeted all of them, so you can check them out. So that's my little wrap up. I'm happy to talk after this at the bar or whatnot. If people have questions, really great event. I'm really impressed with the organizers, and so I would encourage you if you have the chance to go next year and you didn't make it this year, definitely take the opportunity. So I'm going to introduce the first of our speakers tonight. This woman is a recent transplant to New York by way of San Francisco and I think Chicago before that. She works for a startup called Blurb and is going to talk to us tonight about sorting in array controllers. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Estella Madison. Just give it a testing.
Hello. My name is Estella, and I'm here to talk about sorting with array controller. So we use array controllers to sort collections of things in Ember, and it really is just an array proxy that uses the controller mixin and the sortable mixin, which I'll talk about. And it exposes sort properties, which is just a list of properties that you want to sort by. Sort ascending, which is a Boolean value that determines the sort direction. Sort function, which by default is set to Ember.compare, but you can override it and use your own comparison function. And arrange content, which is just the content but sorted. And when I first started using the sortable mixin, it was one of those stupid mistakes that you make where you're still referencing content, but you should have referenced arranged content. And this is an example. Oh, okay. Oh.
If you go to displays.
Oops. Cool, thanks. Can you see that all right? So you'll see I'm just showing a list of articles, which is a really typical use case for using an array controller. And I picked some of my favorite articles from The Onion. And my favorite title is "A Dolphin Spends Amazing Vacation Swimming with Stockbroker." but you can see that you can sort these, and the template just is this here. I'm just using the Ember selects view. It's getting the sort options from the array controller here, and its value is bound to selected sort. So whenever that changes, it triggers this observer here, which sets the sort ascending and sort properties settings properties for us. So it does have to parse it because I'm using publish : ascending, publish : descending. And then back in the template, I'm just using the each handlebars helper to loop through each arranged content. So that's just a pretty simple example. But recently, Balint Erdi wrote an article about how he would sort an array controller, and he used Ember computed sort. And this is a way better way of sorting. And if you don't follow him, his articles are really good. I found them really useful while learning Ember. So Ember computed sort takes two parameters. One is the item's key, and that's just a key to our model or to the content that's being sorted. The second is sort definition, which can be either a key to the array of sort properties or a custom comparison function that you'll use. And I have an example of that as well. So the template is pretty much identical, except now I'm referencing this custom property I added called sorted articles. And I'll hide this for now. But the other difference is instead of the observer, I now have this property called properties to sort by, which gets triggered every time the selected sort changes. Another difference is I'm now sorting by multiple properties, and this is one of the advantages of using Ember computed sort is you can sort by you can sort by different properties in different directions, and you can't quite do that with a sortable mixin. You can, but you have to use a custom comparison function, and that just starts getting really tedious. So apart from the advantage I just mentioned to using Ember computed sort, you can also, like a sortable mixin, you can provide a custom function. But I think all the magic is in having the ability to sort by computed properties. So the template's exactly the same. And you'll see there's a few differences. The first being I now have an item controller specified, which is an article controller. And that's going to be the controller that's assigned to each item in the array. Instead of sorting by title, I'm now sorting by clean title, which is a computed property. So in this example, what I wanted to do was I wanted to eliminate all the stop words like a, the, and an. And I think that's a really probable use case, right? When you sort articles, you don't really want to take those words into account. The other difference is my Ember computed sort has @this. Before, this was just model. And this allows me to observe the changes to the object itself. And like last time, I have my properties to sort by property specified as a second parameter. And this, you'll see the difference really here. So in the other examples, this would have been listed second to last because it was taking an into account. Obviously, these other ones would have come first, but now it's ignoring that and it's making this, taking this first. That's pretty much it. Any questions? Yeah. Yes. So I'm going to show the template again. Oops. So I have the using Ember selects view and then the each handlebars helper to loop through each sorted articles item. So that was for sortable mixin only. And here, now I have this other property called sorted articles. And that's coming from the Ember computed sort. Any other questions?
You think about deciding when to use the sortable mixin and when to use Ember computed sort?
I think going forward, I would stick with Ember computed sort. When I was Googling Ember computed sort, I came across a few pull requests to the Ember repository where people were alluding to phasing out the sortable mixin. I don't know if that's really going to happen, but I just feel like Ember computed sort is just so much cleaner, easier to use, and at least for my use cases, I've usually had to sort by 2 properties in different directions, so it just seems a lot easier.
Did you have a question to us?
Oh, I wanted to make a comment that it's amazing how things work out in Ember, because I've covered a lot of articles in Ember Sherpa, but this is one topic I haven't, and this is like perfect timing because it's the next thing I have to do in my app, so I really appreciate this.
Cool. Thanks. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
I'm going to bring you a mic.
I had a use case where I was trying to filter my array controller, but I also had an item controller, and I didn't want to filter the content array, but I wanted to filter the content array wrapped in item controllers, and I couldn't figure out how to reference the array wrapped in item controllers. So so it seems like addThis.addEach
Yeah.
dot property would be the way to do it. Is that correct?
I think so. I haven't used that yet. I did see it when you look at the source code. I saw that in the comments, but I don't know. Do you know, Luke?
I don't know, actually. Dennis asked this question, I noticed, to Ray earlier today. So I was surprised to see the add this, and I don't understand exactly what it's doing, so we'll have to get back to you.
Yeah, in the source code, if you look for this,
Can you make that bigger?
I was hoping there'd be more comments in this. No, nothing too useful. Yeah. Sorry. Any other questions? Thanks.
Cool. All right. Thanks to Stella. Our next speaker is going to talk to us about how to learn Ember, and it's a really appropriate talk that's meaningful to me because I did a Skype call with this gentleman how long ago?
In August of last year.
August of last year, and he was brand new to the Ember community, very excited and engaged, trying to figure out where to get his footing, how to find work doing Ember, how to learn Ember, and he's come an incredible way, and in the process of doing so, he's also been of service to a large number of people in the community via his Twitter account, Ember Sherpa, and now more recently through giving talks like the one he's about to give here tonight. So with that, I'm really happy to introduce my friend Taras Mankowski.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. And Luke, thank you for taking that call, because when you start off as a beginner learning something like Ember, and where did my video go? It can feel very isolating. You guys have an awesome community here. I'm from Toronto, so we have a great community there too, but we meet once a month, and I was basically, most of the time, felt like I was learning on my own. And being able to talk to someone like Luke and get really awesome answers can make a huge difference. And that's basically, going through that experience made me realize that I didn't want other people to go through the same thing. Like I don't want people to go through learning Ember by themselves. And so that's where Ember Sherpa came from. So my real name is Taras Mankowski. I go by Ember Sherpa on Twitter, and I'm a full-time developer. I've been working with Ember full-time since August 2013. I work for a company called Quandl. We're like a GitHub for time series data. And we have API, and we can do a lot of cool stuff with time series data. So check it out if you're interested in that kind of stuff. My previous experience is PHP and Python, and I've been working with Ember full time, and I want to share share what I learned. So I'm making some assumptions. Actually, before I make assumptions, can I get a raise of hands to see who is new to Ember here? Oh wow, that's awesome. It's really cool. So that's really great, and I'm making an assumption here that you guys have some experience with server-side development, maybe some experience with iOS or Android development, and enough JavaScript to be able to understand what I'm going to be talking about. So our goal is to build ambitious applications with Ember.js. So that's why we're doing this. So this talk is, now that you've read the Ember guides and you built a sample application, and now what? So this talk is, I'm hopefully going to answer that question for you. So it's not a tutorial. My goal is to give you context, to kind of glue things together and give you a path to move forward beyond the guides. When I started, the guides were very basic. I started before 1.0. There was a great push at 1.0 to get the guides going, and we've got even better since then. So we have really awesome guides, but they make there's a lot to Ember. Ember is a very deep framework, and more you understand about it, more effective you can be at actually sitting down, writing some code, and being done with it, and like knowing that you actually did something, you're actually productive. So usually when people start, a lot of times one of the first questions is, maybe not the first, but one of the first questions is, how do you integrate Ember in my application? Because especially if you already have an application and you want to go to Ember because you're growing with your, you have gained some experience with Backbone maybe, or you have experience with jQuery and you want to go beyond that. And so you want to know how would you integrate your Ember application into existing application. And a common answer to that is you basically treat your Ember application as a JavaScript and CSS dependencies. So JavaScript dependencies that you would add to your project as basically like a jQuery plugin. And you would run you would have all your Ember code in a separate project. So if you have your, I would recommend that you don't try to mix your server side and your your browser side application code. It just keeps things really clean and simple, and you know what's where. Your tests run faster. There's a lot of benefits to it. And there's a video that I'm linking to here, and it talks more about integrating Ember into existing applications. So you might want to check it out. So another question that's asked frequently after the first question gets out of the way is, how do I integrate it with my backend? And the simplest answer is that Ember works with your API, so it doesn't know or really concern itself with what's underneath your API. As long as Ember is bootstrapped into the browser and it can make a request to your API, an AJAX request to your API, you will be able to get data into your application. If your API is JSON API compatible, then all the better, because then you'll be able to use Ember data with Ember data adapter, and things will be easier for you. But you can use basically any API. You could probably use something like an XML API. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could use it, and you just have to do more work. But stick with a JSON API of some kind. So now that you you read the guides and you want to actually start to write some code that's not just your basic Ember guides application, you might be wondering, how do I organize my project? And the answer to that question depends on what your goals are. If your goal is to learn, kind of take your understanding to the next level, then I would suggest that you start with something like Starter Kit, because a Starter Kit gives you everything that you need to get started, and it follows the Ember conventions closest, so you don't have to learn anything new when you start writing your application. And so what you get with Starter Kit is you get the namespace resolver. So so the namespace resolver basically means, like, how when you have in the guides you have something like app.application route, for example. So that's the app is the namespace, and it's available in the global scope. And so that's the namespace resolver. So Ember will resolve its conventions based on the class names. The dependencies are all included. It doesn't have an asset compiler, so it's really basic. It's just something that you can use to get started, but not much more than that. It includes QUnits, so you can play around with some testing. It doesn't have ECMAScript 6 modules, no server command like what Luke was describing, and no continuous integration of any kind provided. So Ember command line gives you what you'd want to use when you actually go long term. So if you're ready, like you kind of get an idea how this works, you understand how conventions work, and you're like, okay, now let's go to the next level. The next level is Ember command line. You get file-based resolver, which means that you can break up your application into many small files as opposed to one gigantic JavaScript file. You get Bower for dependency management, so you can bring in other JavaScript and CSS packages. You get Broccoli compiler, which is really asset compiler, which is really fast, and you get QUnit with Testum Runner and ES6 modules and server integration, continuous integration, all this good stuff. So when you're ready to, you're clear that you're ready to build your application, the real thing, you can start create a new app using Ember command line, and you could actually just transfer code from your starter kit, and you have to make some adjustments because you have to break the file into like a bunch of smaller files, and you can be ready to go. So to get started with the Ember command line, I think Luke already showed this. You install the Ember command line utility, and then you go Ember new, whatever your name of the app is, and then it will create your application for you. Your basic foundation for your application. So now that you have your kind of project laid out, whether with Starter Kit or with Ember command line, the first place where you start building your application is the router. And if you read the guides, you'll read something like this. Something like the router manages transitions between states. URL equals serialized state. The router converts URLs to state. You'll read a lot of this kind of stuff. And the problem that I had when I was learning was that I didn't actually know what state is. So state is collection of active objects in memory. So it's a really simple it's a concept that's kind of important to understand. So this let's just see what we got here. Yeah, so let's just go into the next thing. How are these objects in memory created? These objects in memory are created based on Ember conventions. So when you say router map, and inside a router map function you say resource search, what Ember understands is that you probably are going to want to have an application route, an application controller, a search route, a search controller, a search index, search route. Like it makes a bunch of assumptions about what you're going to need. And whether you define those classes, whether or not you define those classes, Ember will actually create those objects for you. So if you in your Ember application, when you're instantiating your application, if you set this log active generation flag, it will actually show you what objects are being created. So what objects in memory are being created for that route. So you could see actually that Ember is creating for you a route application object. So this is without declaring any classes. The same thing for route search index. It's actually creating a state for you. And this state is created from the container. So container is a dependency injection mechanism that instantiates objects and wires them together so that you'll have kind of pre-built, based on conventions, pre-built state. If you want to learn more, about this, and I would suggest that you do, because understanding how the container works kind of demystifies Ember. It's where all the magic, where all the objects, where everything is glued together. It's really great things to know. So Matthew Beal, here from New York, he's got a great talk that he did here on dependency injection. And Ben Donaldson has a talk about how to call A from B that also talks about dependency injection in the container. So let's go back to the router. So the router, when you specify resources in the router map, what you're doing is you're telling Ember how to match URLs to basically how to create state for specific URLs. So if you have a search URL, how to match that URL to kind of scaffolding that needs to happen later on. And so what happens is that Ember will match that URL to a route, and the route is where your state is created. And so, I'll just reiterate the fact that state is objects in memory. So the route sets up objects in memory. Now, there are kind of two. When people say state, there's lots of different state. I would say like there's like a lowercase state, which is basically like whole state, everything. There's like it's a general term, and then there's the state that you kind of care about when you are developing Ember applications, which is the controller state. The controller state is where most of the stuff happens. So the route spends very little time setting up a state. It usually happens like most of the time somebody will click on a link, the route will do its setup for like, I don't know, a couple of seconds. You want that to be as short as possible. And then the controller state kicks in. And the controller state is a long living state. It's something that if you open an Ember app on the URL and you leave it in the tab for like a week, those objects will live in memory for all that time. So that's what that is a state when you're writing applications. A lot of times, what you're going to be thinking about is what is the state of the controller. That's like for me is a capital S state. And so the route sets up the capital S state, the main controller state, and then the view presents that state. So whatever properties you have in your controller state will be represented in the view through your templates, and the views are generated using your route. So I'll just say it again. So the model, the route sets up your state. The model fetches data from the API and provides those models to the controller. So the route is setting up the state that will live for a long time, or at least until somebody transitions to something else or closes a window or something like that. So this is basically, so I mentioned earlier that several times already that the route tells Ember how to configure the state, and this is kind of the default behavior this is the default behavior that Ember will give you whether you define a class or not. So do you have a model function that doesn't really do anything? If you override your model hook, it will set the return value from the model to the controller. So if you don't override the setup controller, the Ember will automatically take the models that you pass to it and set it into the controller. And then it will call the render template to create the views and render the template for that route. So you have, so you've rendered the route, you rendered the templates for that route, and now what? So what happens when, after you click the link, everything, the user can see the template with, with everything that was in the controller. Now what? So nothing really happens. Like the page is sitting there waiting for something to happen. So nothing's really waiting. It's just waiting. Nothing happens until some action is triggered. And so let's say we have a button in the template, and that button has an action on it called search. So when the user clicks on that, the view converts that DOM event into a state action. And then that state action propagates through the state hierarchy until there's a handler on the state hierarchy that can handle that action. So I'll say it again. So the view converts DOM events into state actions, and those state actions propagate through the hierarchy until it gets to the top. So what that looks like is something like this. So let's say in search index, in search index we have that button. So you click on that button. From search index, it's going to try to go up to search index route and try to handle that search action. Okay, search index route doesn't have an action for it. It's going to go up to search route. Then it's going to go up to application route and try to find that handler. If a handler isn't found, then it's going to do this. It's going to give you an error saying a handler for that action isn't defined. So a lot of times I'll get an answer, like a question like, where do you define an action? Where do you find an action for, like where would you put that action? Do you put it in the controller? Do you put it in the route? Which route do you put it into? So I would say that you want to try to find a place where, place in the hierarchy for that action, where that action will be triggered, but not any higher. So if you have a search action might be triggered anywhere in application. So it doesn't have to be like if you put a search field into the top bar, that search action could be triggered on any page that shows the top bar. So that's an action that can be put into application route, for example. But if you have an action that is very specific to a controller, for example, like if you have, you might have an action that updates. That would be an example you put into the route. But you might have an action that updates a model, causes a model to be updated. You probably want to put that into the router. But there are scenarios where actions are limited to just the controller, and then you would put it into the controller. So you just want to make sure that the whole idea of using conventions and logical placing of actions is that you want to be able to come back a week later and say, okay, where would that action be? And think, okay, I would probably put it, and according to some kind of logic, you would find that action without having to go Control F and finding it. So if you want to learn more about actions and events, and it's a really good thing to know, Luke here created an awesome video about this, and I believe you were also the person who actually implemented the action implementation that we use now, right? Yeah, cool. So this video is really good. It's very educational. So now we've talked about state actions, and this kind of brings us to something that we're all very familiar with. Most of us are very familiar with this. If you've done any work with jQuery, you're familiar with this way of thinking. You have a button that has let's say, a submit class. You have a selector button that submit, and when somebody clicks on that button, you want the form to be validated, and then if the validation passes, you want the form to be submitted. This is a very jQuery thing. Like it's very I'd call this a DOM-centric way of handling events. Ember, on the other hand, is, as opposed to being DOM-centric, it's state-centric. So you're thinking about state of your application and usually of your controller. And the difference between, so the way you would do it in Ember, you would, to do the same kind of validation, you would have your search action that's triggered when the button is pressed. But unlike jQuery, where you would have to, at that point, run the validation code to see if validation is passed, you actually want the validation to be already available to you. So you want to have the state of the validation already available. So what you would do is you would just say, if this get is valid, and so what is valid? Is valid is a computer property that is evaluated based on the keyword. So if the keyword changes, the is valid state is automatically recalculated, reevaluated. So what it's doing is it's actually making the is valid state available to you. It's available to you all the time, depending on the state of the controller. And this is kind of a very Ember way. This is a shift in thinking between doing things in jQuery versus doing things in Ember. So what is a computer property? A computer property is a function that looks like a value. It evaluates to a value. So when you define a computer property on a controller, you are assigning a function to a property, but when you look at that, when you get that property, you're actually getting a value. And the way that the value is recalculated when the computer property is read and is invalidated. This is important. So the computer property will only be recalculated if its dependent property is if it's invalidated. For it to be invalidated, its dependent property needs to change. So this is kind of cool because this is also called lazy computed property. Yes, that's what it's called. So what this basically means is that unless there's something reading that property, the value is not reevaluated. But it's good to keep in mind that if you put a property, if you bind to a property in a template, it will, as long as the template being displayed, it will always try to recalculate that property because the bindings are always going to try to keep the template and the properties in sync. So this will like happen sometime, and you'll know what I mean. So just to kind of drive this point home. So the difference between DOM-centric and a state-centric approach is that when you're thinking about in DOM-centric approach in jQuery, you're thinking about it's driven by actions. So you would do things like when that happens, like when the click happens, check this value and then do that thing. And the mechanics are handled by your code. You have to write all that code. With state-centric, it's driven by the value. So when you're thinking about your controller, what you got to think about is when this value is this, what should this other value be? Or usually you would think like, if I'm working with is valid, how does it depend on the state of another property? So you're actually thinking about the value of that property as dependent on another property at any given moment. So you're being really kind of like in the moment thinking. You're not actually thinking about what needs to happen for that value to be available to you. And you want to write your controllers in that way. You actually want to you want to make state available to you. And try to avoid procedural thinking as much as possible. To do this, you have to. I'll go into how to do this. I'll go into it a bit later. But the nice thing about this is that what you get, when you think state, what you get is some really simple code that, that gives you a better user experience. So if you were to, so what this shows here is not valid is the opposite of is valid. But what I'm using here, I'm using a computer property, so I'm using the em namespace. I don't want to write Ember. So em.computed not. So that's a computer property macro that you can use, and then is valid is the dependent property. And then so not will give you the opposite of that value. And so now that we have this is not valid, you can do something like this. You could say button, disable it when is not valid. And so you don't have to even, when you have something like this, you don't even have to write validate, like you don't even have to validate on click, because user can't even click on a button when it's not valid. And that gives it actually a much more responsive experience. And when you think about it this way, you get a lot of freebies like this. So so one thing to keep in mind about computer properties is that they're really fast, but they're not synchronous. So what that means is that if you have a property like keyword, and you try to set it like 3 times in a row, it's not going to reevaluate the value of is valid 3 times. It will reevaluate it only once. And the reason for this is because Ember has something called the run loop, and the run loop is a mechanism that allows you to sync changes onto a built-in run loop. it has queues that you could sync your events onto. So what would happen in this case is the set for keyword Ember, then set keyword is, set keyword grade would be all scheduled onto the sync event on the run loop, and then all of these changes would be coalesced into the final value. And so you'd only do recalculation once. Yeah, exactly. Perfect. So the run loop. So the run loop has some built-in queues, and so these are the queues, and this is their order. So the sync is where all of the computer properties are calculated. So what happens is that if you have this, like the way these queues work is that they work until they're completely depleted. Sorry, they work until they're completely depleted. So if you have a bunch of property changes in the sync queue, it will try to perform all the changes necessary to fulfill those updates. And if there are new ones that are created in the process, it will try to complete those. And it will try to keep doing that until it's done. Then it will move on to actions. And actions is where where promises are resolved. So if your promise has something, so if you have I'm going to talk about promises a bit later, but a promise is a mechanism that allows you to do async, handle async. So if you have a promise that that after the promise is fulfilled, you have to do some setting. What will happen is when that happens, it will queue up another set, and it will go back to sync. It will do the sync again, and then go to actions. So it keeps going through this cycle until everything is depleted, and then we'll move on to route transitions. So this is the mechanism also that allows us to do things like wait until the route is finished. Wait until the promise is resolved. So if your route model hook returns a promise, and then that promise takes, let's say, 5 seconds to resolve, this mechanism will allow us to wait for the promise to be resolved before entering that route, before rendering that template. So that's kind of the inner. So when you understand how these things work, you actually start to understand a little bit of how Ember works. So then render event, and then there's the after render. So after render is where after render is the event where you can, after render is where you could do things like trigger jQuery. If you have, let's say, a bunch of things that all require jQuery to be triggered, a jQuery call to be made, some kind of maybe like apply some changes to the DOM, you can schedule an event onto the after render queue, and then have it happen once. after render. So after the DOM is created for you, you can apply that event instead of doing it every time that the things are rendered. Some of these things, like if I'm not sure, it's hard to judge the vibe, but if some of these things are putting you to sleep, it's okay. Because part of the intention of this talk is that I want to give you things, I want to expose you to things that make Ember work, so that when you hear them, you'll like, oh, I remember what Ember Sherpa was saying, and go back to this video and actually see, like, watch it again, and it will actually make more sense. And then, so the last queue is the destroy, and so that's where the objects are destroyed. So the objects are destroyed last. So once everything is done, if in the process of doing any of these other queues you destroyed an object, you went like, object.destroy with braces, it will happen there. So destroying objects happens at the end. And there's some useful functions that are helpful to know. Yeah, go ahead.
Real quick, right before that, that's synced event.
Yeah.
There's like the three, set Ember is great. So when that's all done, have those actually been bundled into one synced event?
Yes.
One search for all three words, or is it just the last word great?
Well, it's the last one, basically. The last one wins. Well, that's a slightly different thing. So this is, if you ran your code, like if you wrote 3 things after another, then great would win because it's the last one in a list. What you're talking about is, well, from what I understand, what you're saying is if you were to type in like 3 different things, so what would happen is that in that situation, it would reevaluate like 3 different times because there's a lot of things that are happening in the round loop that it's a lot faster than people can type. Right, and so what you would use in that situation, like this is applicable to autocomplete fields, for example, because when you type in some input in autocomplete field, you don't want your autocomplete to cause like an AJAX request for every autocomplete field. So what you want to do in that situation, you'd want to use like a debalance or a throttle. So what that would do is it would actually control. So throttle, Ember run throttle allows you to control how many times a function is called within a given time interval. Debalance and throttle, like debalance, you have to read the description there. They're very nuanced in how they work, but they're good to know. So like whether you're going to be using them today or not is like you probably won't be, but it's good to know that those things are there because you will encounter them. And so I'll go back up the other direction now. So schedule once is what I was when I was saying about the after render. If you want to make sure that you don't make like jQuery changes to the DOM too frequently, then you could use schedule once with after render to make sure that the function that is going to be the callback that's going to be doing processing is going to be making DOM changes is only going to be ran once after the DOM is rendered. Ember run later is a run loop compatible version of set timeout. So if you're going to use set timeout for whatever reason, you want to use Ember run later because it will run the Ember run function. So Ember run function triggers the run loop to run, and Ember run later will trigger the run loop to run automatically when you async when your set timeout is expired or ready to run. Again, this is pretty deep stuff, and then but I hope that you kind of keep in your memory bank so that when you're ready, it'll be available to you. Oops, sorry. So there's a Ember the run loop guide, which put together recently, and it's great. And there's a new video called the Ember run loop, and Jason Matson goes into a lot more detail about how all this stuff works.
We also had a great run loop talk in the last couple of months by Brendan Briggs, which is up in the Ember NYC channel on YouTube too.
Okay, cool. Maybe I don't have it. I gotta find it and cut it out. Promises. So promises. You might have come across this. I don't know so promises basically is a way to work with async functionality in a way that kind of resembles synchronous. So the problem with asynchronous making asynchronous calls is that asynchronous calls by default don't return a value. So if you call a function, you can't return something because your code already kind of finished doing its thing, and then async comes in like 2 seconds later, and now you're lost. You're kind of nowhere. And so what promises do is they allow you to promise returns an object that you can use to chain onto using the then method. So what you see here is, so I have this IC Ajax. IC Ajax is a promise compatible jQuery Ajax replacement. So jQuery has a problem with the way that they implement their Ajax. It doesn't implement promises properly the way that we'd want to see it, like according to spec. So IC Ajax is something you'd want to use if you're going to be making arbitrary, if you're going to be making Ajax requests like this directly, you'd want to use IC Ajax instead of jQuery Ajax. And so IC Ajax will return you a promise, and then you can use .then. So so this .then should actually be on the same line as IC Ajax, but you could write it this way as well. So basically, it's chained. Then is chained onto the promise, and it takes two callbacks. It takes a function for successful resolution and a function for the error. So it actually allows you to handle error cases in a proper way. So like if your Ajax request return a 404, you can handle that scenario. So you can. There's a lot of cool things you can do with promises. One of them is you can actually. I'll cover that in a second. So these links are really helpful. So there's a link to the IC Ajax and a link to the loading and error states. So Ember is really smart about how it handles promises in the model hook. If you return a promise to a model hook, it will wait for the promise to resolve, but if it takes longer than 200 milliseconds, it will automatically try to go into the load state, show you a load screen, or give you an opportunity to show a load screen to the user. So you can learn more about this in that guide. And the same thing goes for errors. So if your promise resolves to an error, like a 404, then it will automatically show you, or give you an opportunity to show that error to the user. And Stefan Panner has a really great video about promises, and if you want to learn more, and I suggest you do, it's a great video to watch. So I have a link to it here. So, Ember's promises implementation. Actually, before I go, does anybody have any questions about promises? Promises? Anybody? No. Ember's promises implementation is provided by this library called rsvp.js. And rsvp.js is built into Ember, so you could do em.rsvp. And then you have a bunch of functions available on it. So some of the things that you might want to know about are all and hash. All allows you to pass an array of promises, and that the main promise won't resolve until all of the promises have been resolved. So it will actually wait for all of the Ajax requests to be made in this scenario before returning the value. So in this situation, like this model in the controller, what you would get is you would get an array with two values. One would be the value that resolved for the Ajax request post 1, and the other one for Ajax request post 10. So that gives you an array. So all gives you an array. If you wanted to have an object, so like if you wanted to have posts and comments, then you can use the hash, and then the hash will return a promise that will resolve to a hash, and it will be whatever it is. So if you say post and then make post and you make a Ajax request to post, it will give you the value in post property, and then the same thing for comments. So you'd get in your controller, you would get an object that has two properties, post and controller. Just one thing to be careful about this is that if you make these 2 requests, there's a chance that it's going to slow down that 1 request. So just be conscious of the fact that if you do this, it's quite possible that your request will take longer because it has to load 2 things instead of just 1. And you can see the complete documentation for this library on the GitHub repository for this project. Yeah. I don't actually use it that often, but in theory, if you have a bunch of things that honestly, I can't right now because but like I want you to know about these things so that you get an idea of where you could look to see the different things. There's other things in there as well, and look, can you think of?
Sure. One example might be if you have, let's say you're allowing the user to save an arbitrary number of models at once, and each of them, the way your API works, you need to hit your API for each one. What you could do is assemble those requests into an array, fire them off using rsvp.all, and you get a callback. Then the then action on the then handler on it would be fired once all of them had hit the server and come back successfully. So, yeah, I mean, if you think about that, the general problem of I've got to do a bunch of things, I don't know how long they're all going to take, but I want to know when they're all done. If you can do that manually. You can like set a counter in the beginning, decrement it when each one returns, and each time check to see if it's 0. Or you could use something like this. It's a lot easier.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so he said if you have to hit 2 different APIs, for example, to store information, that's another good example.
Makes sense. Thanks, Luke. So let's go to the next one. Okay, so so this is kind of to illustrate why you have to understand what promises are and how they work, because you can get into a situation like this. So does anybody know, like, can somebody tell me what's happening here? Can you see what the problem here is?
It looks like a promise is going from rejected to fulfilled.
Right. Do you guys know why that might be happening? So, so it's good to know how promises work, because if you return a value from the error handler, it will be automatically fulfilled. So you can actually convert a failed case, failed promise into a successful promise. And this can trip you up because you could accidentally, you might not think about the fact that returning a value from that function will make a big difference, but in this problem it will completely change the scenario. So promises are really powerful, but you have to understand how they work, and this is why it's really helpful to know how they work. And that video is really good at explaining that kind of stuff. Yeah, so if you nest a bunch of promises, you keep returning promises, and then it's going to it will have to handle the last promise before, and then resolve it to the value. All right, so this is the part of the talk where I've been there a bunch of times, and everybody gets there where you got some problem, you have no idea what the hell is going on. And so this part of the talk is about how to get unstuck. So what you want to do is, like what I usually do, and I've done this a bunch of times before, is just basically you try to identify the problem, you isolate the problem, and then you make it better. And the way you identify the problem is the order of things. Usually, I would usually do the console. I'd look in the console to see what's the error, and try to kind of devise a way to find the problem from the error. I'll try the purple button, then try the debugger, and then go to the Ember inspector. Now, that order is not necessarily, depending on what you're doing, you might know where to look for the problem, but I'll show you how to use each one of these. So you can activate very detailed logging in Ember using this. So we had the log activate generation, but you can specify more. So there's like log transition. It will give you information about transition. So it'll tell you, like, I'm going into this post. if you use this log transitions internal true, then you'll get really detailed logging. You'll get detailed logging about every single step in the route transition. And the last one, log view lookups, is helpful when you're putting paths to views in the template, and it's just, and Ember tells you like, oh, I don't know where this view, I don't know what this view is. And so you can with the log view lookups, you could actually see how Ember is trying to convert the paths that you're passing to templates and views. So it's a good thing to have in your console. Then the purple button. So this button is blue, which I don't like. I don't know. I think Chrome is trying. I don't know what they're trying to do, but this used to be purple and now it's blue, but it's probably gonna be purple again next release. So, but there's also a blue button, but that's not the button that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the purple button. But the purple button doesn't do what I want it to do. So, but it's supposed to be the purple button. But try them both anyway. So basically, what it does is it will the purple button is supposed to stop when an error occurs. So if there's an error if there's an exception that's not handled, it will stop there exactly. And that's really helpful when you've got a bunch of things going on and nothing and it's like you don't even know where the problem is occurring, but it's happening somewhere and it's too late. So you can use the purple button, and it will, when an error occurs, like in this situation I'm showing here, I just put in a value, a variable crash that's not declared anywhere, and so it would throw an exception, and it would stop right there and tell me that exception occurred there. Another thing that you can use is this debugger. You can put this into your code. So if you don't know. Like sometimes it's easier to just put debugger into your code than it is to go and find, then set the breakpoint in your console. So I use debugger all the time. It's really helpful. I just throw it in your code, refresh the page, and it will stop at that particular situation. And the other thing you might want to, I would recommend that you try to use named functions as much as possible. So Ember right now is going through transition to ES6 and ES6 modules, and in the process they're actually taking out all of the anonymous functions, so they're naming all the functions. So you should get like when you look at the log, you will have very good kind of description of what's going on, and you want to, because most of the problems are going to be introduced by your code, you want to be able to recognize your code. So if you have anonymous functions like this, like the one you have on the left, so you have the map with a function, then what you'll see is this. You'll just see anonymous. And you can't, it's hard to connect that to something that you wrote. And so if you name that function, you'll be able to recognize it right away. And so what you would do in a situation, you would just, you would name that function in scope, and you would use that named function instead of the anonymous function. Okay, so this brings us to the Ember Inspector. So Ember Inspector is one extension that made the biggest difference in how I think every Ember developer works with Ember. Because before Ember Inspector existed, we were kind of guessing, because a lot of conventions, and you don't know if something's broken, you don't know what's broken, and how to look at things. So Ember Inspector, it's an extension that you can install on Chrome or Firefox, and it allows you to look at your application, and it will show you, you can actually inspect each of these objects, each of the states, and look at their properties and see exactly what's going on. There's a video by Stefan Penner as an introduction to the Ember Inspector. You could take a look at that. It's live. So the inspector has a bunch of different panes, and so one of them is routes. So the routes pane will give you, when you specify that search resource, Ember makes a bunch of assumptions, and those assumptions are actually listed for you. So you have all of the routes that are created. The bolded routes that you see right here are actually, these are the active routes. So that's the route that you're actually on, and the hierarchy of routes there are. So you're in application, search route. And you can see here on the routes, you can see the conventions that are being used. So if you're not sure what to call the particular class to declare that class. You could go in here and see, okay, so Ember expects me to name that class search results route. And you also get template paths, which could be useful because sometimes it's hard to tell if it's supposed to be using a dot or semicolon, or not semicolon, forward slash. The property inspector. So this is really useful because you could actually see what each of the properties in the controller is. And if you see this little calculator here, that means that it's a computer property. So that computer property, instead of showing you that it's a function, it's actually showing you the value for that computer property. And you can use this little $$E button link. If you click on that, it will take this object that you're looking at and it'll put it into the console for you, so you could actually inspect it right there. So if you've got this $E.get is valid, you could actually just do that right there and see what the value is, and you'll get the same values as you see in the inspector. So you could actually work with the objects that are like inner objects of your Ember application. The view tree, if you activate the components and all views at the bottom, it will show you all the views and all the components. So by default, it won't show you that, but if you have a component or if you want to inspect the state of a view, you can activate these and you can actually inspect views the same way as you'd expect a controller. And lastly, the promises. So promises only made it into the inspector a couple of months ago. Until at that point, you had no idea how many promises were created, what they do, how they resolved, how they got to the state that they were in. And the promise pane actually shows you all that information. You can catch a lot of, you'll be surprised actually how many promises there are in one execution or one transition. So, okay, so isolating the problem. So this is actually, this is something I've done a bunch of times, and I recommend that you do it because it's really helpful in understanding how things work, and it gives you experience. So what you do is, once you understand what's going on, and it can be hard to, like a lot of times as a beginner, you think something's wrong, maybe it's Ember, 99.99% it's you, but you don't know what part of it is broken. Like you don't know if you're not using it properly, you don't know what's going on. So what you do is you try to understand the problem, and then you go and you create a JS bin. So we have an Ember.js.jsbin.com. You go and create that, rebuild the entire problem in JS. And then the cool thing about doing the JS bin is that because it's kind of awkward to use, it's awesome, but it's not perfect. It just makes you focus on your problem because you want to just get in there, get it done, and get out. You know, but if you do this, you can actually, the end result is that you will see, first of all, if the problem is with Ember, like is it something about the Ember version that you're using? Is it or is it something about how you understand the problem? And then you can recreate it, and then you can post it on Stack Overflow or discuss on the Discord site, and you can ask questions, and people can actually go and look at your code. So that's one thing you got to keep in mind. If you're asking for help, you have to make it as simple as possible for the person to help you, because like I can't, most of the time I won't be able to help if I have to spend more than 5 minutes looking at the code. Try to keep it as simple as possible, like as few concepts as possible. Just really identify the problem, and you'll get, like I know, for example, with Stefan Penner, like if I have a question, if I ask him, if I try to get his attention, I probably won't be able to, like on IRC, but if I send him a tweet and I can if I can describe my problem in a tweet, he'll answer it. So the same goes for a lot of Ember guys. You can get really good help if you're able to like succinctly communicate what problem you're having. And it's hard, but it's part of the learning process. And this is something, so the last part of this talk is making friends. One thing about Ember community, so we both came from EmberConf, Luke and I, and one of the things that you see there is the friendships that people build. And that's how you learn Ember. You learn Ember from other people, and I would encourage all of you to like get to know other people in Ember community and try to help each other as much as possible, because that's how you make sure that you don't feel isolated. So that's it. You guys have any questions?
I'll run the mic around.
in an early slide, you showed a search action within a search controller that was gated by an isValid
Yeah.
method. But you also talked about having an ever-present search
Yeah.
element and how you would handle that.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about, again, just bubbling up actions and how you would validate something that would sit across various controllers and not just the search controller?
Luke, can you repeat the question?
Sure. So he said that you showed an example of handling a search action with a valid check in a search controller.
Yeah.
But then you also talked about the scenario where you might have in a top bar the search box
Right,
and button.
right.
And so how do those ideas interact?
Right.
And how do you think about that?
Yeah, so that particular example, like I needed to put code into one slide, so that's part of the reason why I was in that search controller. I have in Quandle application, we have search, and search lives in the application route. And the reason for that is that search can be triggered really from any place in the application. But for example, paginate only lives in the search route because I only paginate right now in my in the search section of the application. So my my paginate action is only in a place where it's used, which is right now in the search section of the application. And in that situation, you can actually just so when I'm doing pagination, I'm just transitioning to a different route, and in that situation, I'm just changing the query parameter for that page.
My question is, how would you perform that same gated validation across on a route?
Oh, you mean the actual validation? That's. I mean, I need to think about it.
I think is the intent of the validation in that example is it's checking like the contents of the search form? Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's the
So,
example.
I mean, so I think one way to approach that would be in your template in the top bar area, you could use a render helper and say render search, for example, and then have a search template and a search controller. Inside of the search template, you have the action helper, right, which sends the action. It goes first to the search controller. The search controller has all the information that it needs there to do that validation. It can be data bound to the search field. So it can have a field it looks like to see, is there anything in this field? Is it enough characters or whatever your logic is? And it doesn't need to, you don't need to bubble it up any further up into the router, for example.
Yeah, that's good. I think so. A couple of things.
In that case, yeah, the check would just live in a controller. And I would say validations in general tend to live at the controller layer.
Yeah. I'm actually. I was telling Luke that if you'll have me back, I'll give a talk on that particular use case. So that's if that's I might prepare a talk about that in particular.
I just wanted to add to that last point. One of the things you can do is if you have an error from that validation, you can return that error up to the route and show it in, say, the top of the screen.
Yeah, it's a good way to do it. That's right.
Cool. Other questions?
I'm not sure. Hello. Thanks for the talk. It's very good to teach beginners like me, and it's appreciated. Something I've run into a lot is being able to inspect my controllers and even my models in the console without using the inspector. Sometimes you just want to be able to play with it. And whenever I inspect my controllers, I see a whole bunch of internal code. And sometimes I just want to see the relevant properties on a controller. What's the best way that you two handle that?
I don't know if it's possible, right? Like, I mean, when you inspect an object, you get everything that's in there.
Yeah, I mean, the best way in terms of enumerating properties, I guess I would say two things. Really, the best way is the Ember inspector's layout. I usually don't find myself with the need to say, like, what are all the properties in this object? I think more frequently, I want to understand what is the current value of a property, and for that, you can use either the inspector or you can look up get a handle to the controller in the console. Usually, I'll use app._container.lookup controller controller name. I don't know if have you run into this. So
Yeah.
so that's a great point. So, if you read the guides, you will see don't use _container _. And here's what that means: do not use that in production code. Okay, it does not mean don't use it for debugging. In debugging, I would say the rule about what is okay to use is this: anything that works,
Yeah.
right? And accessing the container that way is perfectly fine. I used to do that exclusively all the time. Have now, over the last probably 2-3 months since the Ember Inspector has matured, pretty much my first go-to tool is the Ember Inspector now. It's really good, and it's pretty fast. But that's how we usually would get a handle to a controller, and then I'll just poke it. I'll say get this value, and if that value is not what I expect, I'm like, okay, why? And so usually then I'll look, okay, what are its dependent keys values? Find out that, and then through that you can kind of deduce what's going on. Brendan made it from EmberConf. Welcome.
The problem with inspecting objects too is that a lot of times you look at the object, you're not going to see the value you're looking for, the property you're looking for. Especially if it's like a proxy controller or something, like the property is on the content, the value you're looking for is in the content property. So looking at objects in the console is usually not very useful.
Right, there's a lot of dynamic stuff going on.
Yeah.
So when I say get foo on an object, there's a bunch of different ways and the answer can come back. One of them is using for example, object proxies unknown property, which means an object can define any logic it wants of how to handle somebody trying to get an unknown property. And so, of course, you're not going to be able to analyze that statically. Other questions? Cool. All right, let's give Taras a big hand.
Can I just say one other thing? If you guys have any questions, you can send the questions to me via Twitter. Send me JS bins. I'll be more than happy to look at them. And there's an Ember Sherpa YouTube channel that has all these videos. This video will be on there. So